Welcome to the Association's Futures Podcast, brought to you by Association Activision. We ask you to join us to discuss the future of the Association's community. How can we build and focus on the many futures we will see during these disruptive times? Let's get started with today's guest.
Welcome, friends, to another podcast from Association Futures. I'm Michael Butera, your host. And today I'm pleased to have as our guest Bruce Rosenthal, a strategic advisor, consultant, and educator to associations and not-for-profit organizations, creating corporate partnership programs that increase revenue, add membership and constituent value, and foster organizational sustainability. Bruce demonstrates his leadership in identifying and cultivating sponsorships and partnerships, next practices, opportunities, and solutions as convener of the Partnership Professionals Network, PPN. Welcome to the podcast, Bruce. Thanks for agreeing to be on the show.
Thanks, Michael. Glad to be here.
Yeah, well, this is a very interesting subject that we're working on, Bruce, and both you and I have written articles for Associations Evolve. And in this year's edition, I noticed that you wrote an article called A Half Dozen Ways to Improve Your Association's Corporateship Programs. So you're giving them advice. So let's start there. What's your advice to the association and the potential business partners they may have?
Well, I think that, especially as it relates to boards and governance, sometimes I think boards can get too involved, and sometimes I think they don't get involved enough. And definitely boards should not be involved in the day-to-day pricing of sponsorships and lists of benefits and all that. And I think there are also instances where boards are afraid of corporate sponsors and don't want to be involved. I had talked to an association CEO a number of years ago, and his associate, I said, well, tell me about your association sponsorship program. He said, well, we don't have one anymore. And I said, well, what happened to it? You had one and now you don't. He said, well, yeah, we had a sponsorship program. And one of the benefits that the sponsors received was a dinner with the board of directors at our annual conference. And the board members decided they didn't want to be bothered with meeting with the sponsors, so they ended the sponsorship program. So we no longer have a sponsorship program at our association. So I think that there are appropriate ways that boards can be involved. Because the reality is, as I heard from an association CEO I worked with years ago, the association's members and the sponsor's customers are the same people. So as the association is fulfilling its mission and working to support members, the companies are doing the same thing from a slightly different vantage point. The companies are selling a product or service, but the association is also selling education and publications and leadership development programs and all that. So I think they're both selling, and the companies, in fact, are educating, and the companies have, in many cases, a wealth of R&D information, and if nothing else, they have sales information. What are members buying and what are they not buying? And as much as associations have staff that are out there all the time talking to members and getting the pulse on what members' challenges are, so are the corporate sponsors. So they have sales teams out there all the time, again, from the lens of selling their product or service. But the sales folks can also say, wow, here's a trend. Here's something new challenging members, or here's something that's working well for members. And in many cases, I think that some of the corporate sponsors can offer boards an added layer of foresight and forecasting that the association and its board may sometimes lack.
Well, in your work, do you see something in particular that associations do that makes it less likely that they will be able to partner with a particular sponsor?
Well, I think that the sponsorship world has changed significantly over the years, and many associations are still locked in, I think, a very old paradigm. In fact, I have a slide in one of my presentations of a marketplace in medieval times with the booths set up and folks selling their wares, their baskets and food and other sorts of things. And to some extent, we put sponsors and exhibitors in that same box for hundreds of years, and in the case of associations, for many decades. And then we said, well, I think the big pitfalls there, we've said that the sponsorship is 3 days during the conference, and that it's based on visibility, recognition, logo placements, and a shout out from the podium. And as I've talked to a lot of corporate partners and worked with a lot of associations over the years, the companies are saying, even when they're saying fantastic conference, they're saying that was 3 days. We market 365 days a year, or this year with leap year, even an extra day. So the companies are looking for that ongoing visibility and recognition and positioning. And then I think that we've generally many sponsorship programs are the gold, silver, bronze, platinum. I've seen as many as 7 of the heavy metal levels. And then sometimes even the process for a company to partake in those programs is send an email to sponsorship at xyzassociation.org, and that's the extent of the personalizing. So especially since COVID, well, let's go back to pre-COVID when I worked at an association, and a sponsor company came to us and said, well, we have some ideas on an education program for your members. How can we present that? And I would list all the rules and regulations and limitations. Well, submit a proposal, and our webinar schedule is booked up for 6 months, so we can get you in later in the year. And maybe we can fit something in at the convention. So we pretty much said, if you want to reach or teach our members, you need to do it through our association. And now after the last 4 years, we're all very familiar with how to sit in front of a Zoom screen. And we're all very familiar with, if you do want to sit in front of that Zoom screen or access that white paper, you check off that little box on the sign-up form that says, you can use my name. So the result has been, my colleague talked to a company last year and about the company's sponsorship of an association, and the company said, well, we've actually created our own online community of 10,000 members of the association. So it kind of begs the question, do we need to be a sponsor? Because now we can reach and teach without going through all the procedures and roadblocks that the association puts up. Now, I always think it's important to add to that companies do value the brand affinity and the partnering with associations and the co-branding with associations. So that is definitely a huge added value that associations can leverage to increase the value of their sponsorship program. But again, if the company's here, there are a whole bunch of roadblocks and screens and limitations and delays, the company will say, well, we have our list of 10,000 of your members. We can just do our own webinar in 3 weeks.
Wow. Well, in the introduction, I mentioned that you're the convener of the Partnership Professionals Network. I guess PPN for short.
Right.
Yeah. So what was your decision to convene the group, and how do you see the network advancing a 21st century vision for the association community?
So PPN started about 10 years ago. I was at a seminar about corporate sponsorships, and when the seminar was over, and it was we learned a lot in the seminar. When the seminar was over, a couple of us were chatting, a few association execs, and we said, we'd really like to continue this education, continue this learning. Where would we do that? And we said, well, sometimes there's a session or two at the ASAE annual meeting on sponsorships. This was, again, 10 years ago, before there were a whole range of webinars every week. And somebody said, well, is it kind of like expo sales? There are some sessions out there in expo sales. And we said, well, it's really not as transactional as expo sales. And someone said, well, how about fundraising? There's a big fundraising association. Well, it's not really donors and planned giving and all of that. It's really about sponsorships and partnerships. So we couldn't find any other venue, so we created our own venue. So we created PPN, and it started with monthly meetings in the DC area, kind of everywhere from DC, Annapolis, Alexandria, downtown DC, and then expanded in the Chicago area with a colleague of mine. And we would have monthly discussions. And there were a couple of things interesting about those discussions. We got people to come. We just kind of created a list and expanded the list and put out the word. We often had a topic, um, though we often found we never quite got to the topic because we would do the introductions around the table with 20 or 25 folks, and somebody would say, "Can you guys help me with this problem?" And we'd spend 10, 15 minutes brainstorming and helping them with that problem. We also found that in the introduction, seldom did anybody have sponsorship or partnership in their title. They were director of membership, and the CEO said, "Oh, sponsorships, this is a new member category. You're in charge." Or they were in charge of exhibit sales, and the CEO said, "Oh, sponsorships, that's kind of like exhibit sales to these companies. Take it from there." So there wasn't a lot of bench strength around uh, sponsorship and partnership practices in associations. Um, and then we also found that, some folks came to the meeting and I'd say, "Oh, how would you find this?" And they said, "Well, we did a Google search and couldn't find any other information out there on sponsorships and partnerships." Um, so that was 10 years ago. I think what we've seen now since through COVID and beyond, that there are a whole range of associations and organizations and networking groups and online forums and all that on a whole range of topics. But we created that for PPN 10 years ago and started doing some in-person trainings, half day and full day in the DC and the Chicago areas pre-COVID. And again, found a lot of folks who were I mean, the other common denominator we often found is these folks are very isolated within their association staff. So when we had the PPN networking meetings, it was closed door. We never took notes. We never reported anything with names, because folks would often come and say, "Can I just talk about this? My CEO has like no support for this program. He said I should just go in my office and call companies, and I'm sure that companies want to give you money." So even when associations had hired somebody with a title like director of sponsorships, there wasn't a lot of support for that. Um, so in fact, we had done a couple trainings around how do you get your team on board, including your board of directors, because we also often found there were boards, and again, while boards shouldn't be into the day-to-day management of a sponsorship program, they should support it as an initiative in the same way the board would support a research initiative or a distance learning initiative or expanded conference program. But we sometimes found boards that said, "Well, we don't really, the companies I'm sure will give us money. We can just, have somebody give them a call." Or if the company's been a sponsor for years, I'm sure they'll continue to be a sponsor. So I think it is important for senior staff at associations as well as boards to be supportive of a sponsorship program and to bring on staff that have the qualifications. And I think one reason some of these sponsorship folks are kind of isolated within their association staff is they're seen as doing something maybe inappropriate or inconsistent. And when I had worked for an association and was promoted to a new position in the association as VP of Corporate Partnerships, one of my colleagues who had worked at the association for over 20 years came up to me after the announcement went out about my new role running the partnership program. And she said, "Well, Bruce, I guess congratulations, but you've gone to the dark side." So we really, we're promoting these companies, and we don't know if they're good products and services and all that. But I think what has changed in recent years, especially with these opportunities for companies to reach and teach on their own, that if associations don't have a good sponsorship program to bring in those sponsorship dollars, companies will either spend those sponsorship dollars with other associations or with a whole range of other places now. So when I do competitive analyses for associations relating to their sponsorship programs, I'm coming up with lists of 30, 40, 50 competitors. So other associations, online groups, for-profit associations. And I think we sometimes think that, well, this company's been a sponsor for years, I'm sure they'll continue. I was doing a session, I think at an ASAE conference 5 or 6 years ago, and during the Q&A, somebody said, I'm a new CEO of an association, small association, and one of our longtime corporate sponsors called me and said they'd like to meet and talk. So he said, since I was a new CEO, I called our board chair and said, "Could you join me in this meeting? I think we should talk to this company." And the board chair said, "Yeah, I don't think we need to talk to the company. They've been a sponsor for years. I'm sure they'll continue to be a sponsor." So again, I think an appropriate role for the board to jump in and say, yeah, I'd be glad to join you in that meeting and let's look for that value proposition. But this kind of shift in what are the core competencies of sponsorship staff. I met a woman a few years ago who worked for an association, not-for-profit employment agency. And I said, when your agency is working with an association client and the client is looking for someone to run their sponsorship program, do you consider tapping into folks that have worked for marketing agencies or have marketing expertise? Or worked for a marketing division of a company. And she said, oh, we can't do that. And I said, well, why can't you do that? And she said, because our marching orders from many association CEOs, when we recruit for them, we must recruit from other associations.
Oh my
People who
goodness.
have association background. Again, kind of like it's an either or of a good side and a bad side. And not that somebody, I tried to explain, I think there are people who work for marketing agencies, know how to meet the needs of companies, and also have not-for-profit expertise, either as part of a job or community service or with a religious organization or community organization. So I don't think the for-profit, not-for-profit is the absolute mindset division between the two. But I think that while associations absolutely need to develop sponsorship programs that are in alignment with the organization's mission and the needs of its members, it is a business and working, coming up with business partnerships with sponsor companies.
A few times in our discussion so far, you've mentioned the idea that the corporate sponsor or partner has education that they can provide. And I would think that in the way the traditional professional society thinks of itself, that might be a tension with them. And I'm wondering how, in your consulting work, you work around that issue so that there's an understanding of the value that both bring to the educational side.
Sure. Well, from the vantage point, so education and involving sponsors in education can be a challenge and an opportunity. Again, I think keeping in mind this competitive advantage, companies are going out there and educating on their own. So if the association doesn't want to work with them, companies will still find ways to reach members. And I mentioned a number of times in presentations that, the association is a big tent, but companies are setting up their own education tents and members are going over to those tents. So if you want everybody in your big tent, you have to make it appealing to members as well as sponsors. I think obviously one clear challenge is the education program is for education credits or CMEs or whatever, especially in medical associations, as well as other associations, there are some firewalls there. But I think, again, from the members always come first. From the member standpoint, members want good education, unbiased education. So one of the things I learned from the education director at an association where I used to work, where we were talking about how can we appropriately involve our sponsors and corporate partners in education. And she said, well, Bruce, what our goal really is to talk to these companies about educate to sell, don't sell to educate. So if you educate members, some of them will be impressed with what you're talking about and will give you a call or respond to something on your website. But I think it also involves coaching the companies that you can't sell during this session and you can't mention your product name and even challenge companies. How can you talk about the product or service that you have to offer and what it does for members without ever mentioning the product or service or product number or catalog page or whatever? And companies should be able to do that. And again, this is a partnership. All partnerships don't work. If the company doesn't get it, if they don't agree to that, then it's like, well, feel free to buy an exhibit booth or an ad, and we'll talk again later. We'll stay friends, but this partnership around education may not work. So, but you're absolutely right, Michael. Companies have a wealth of expertise and research and R&D and finger on the pulse of what's going on with members. And I think it's also important to remember that members do need to buy products and services. So I think many of us have had experiences if we're staffing an education session at an in-person conference and the panelists include some corporate folks, some sponsors, and when the session is over, members come up to that faculty and say, Do you have a brochure? Can you tell me about your contract terms? Do you have a website I can go to? If I stop by your booth later, can I get more information about making a purchase? So again, there needs to be a division, especially for sessions for credit based on the rules of the accrediting agencies. But members do want to buy product and service. So I think when there is that opportunity to, and maybe somebody even suggested to me, if it's going to be an hour and a quarter session, can an hour of it be education and 15 minutes or 10 minutes at the end be, yeah, talk about your product or service, answer members' questions about contract terms and pricing and where your regional offices are, and kind of make an appointment with a sales rep and all that.
Well, as we wrap up, Bruce, I'd like to pose one question. It has a couple parts to it, actually. So, in the world of giving advice and setting up these programs, what would you most want the CEO to understand? And what would you most want the board to understand as they develop these partnership sponsorship relationships?
I think for developing a successful sponsorship and partnership programs, it's important for both the association CEO or executive director and the board to know that it's a very competitive kind of open source environment out there, that members have choices and companies have choices. And we see many instances now of members, and again, especially since COVID, joining a whole range of online networking groups, other associations. There are for-profit associations. There's one for women executives called Chief that's getting millions of dollars of venture capital to expand and meet the needs of folks. And I've talked to a lot of women association executives who are joining Chief because they're getting information they're not getting from their association. So I think if associations, and I've talked to a number of associations about that, of almost positioning the association not as, oh, we are a membership association of X thousand members, but we are a think tank. We are a fountain of knowledge. We are the experts in this space. And then bring together all the players, to bring together members, non-members, students who are interested in that trade or profession, as well as the companies. And it's a true partnership because I don't think that, especially now with so much being available online and readily available to folks, and members are making a clear distinction between, oh, that's a corporate webinar, or that's because I think we've all gone to, even this podcast. You and I, Michael, are both running for-profit consulting agencies, but we're providing good information. So I think there are a lot of companies that have figured out that they can provide good information, and I think there are just a lot of opportunities for boards as well as the CEO to demonstrate to members that it is a partnership, that we're all working with you together. I had worked with an association a number of years ago that had kind of a corporate advisory council that included their top tier corporate partners, year-long corporate partners, as well as their board members. And they met together, they identified the top 4 issues that were affecting that profession. And then they divided up into 4 task forces, and each task force had co-chairs. One of the co-chairs was the corporate partner, the other was a board member. So again, it showed they're working together. And then each of the 4 task forces went off for a few months and developed a solution, a white paper, a video, whatever, and then of course the task force members were both corporate partner folks and board members, and each task force identified a solution to that problem that was facing members. So very focused on members first, but the board and the corporate partners working together to come up with solutions. And then the association pushed out those white papers and those toolkits for those 4 task forces. And then it had a tie to the annual conference of doing a session where the different panelists identified those 4 solutions and talked about them. So it was a win. It was a triple win. It was a win for the members first. They got really good information on the top 4 challenges that they faced. The companies got a huge amount of visibility around content and expertise. And then since it had a conference component, some folks stopped by those corporate booths afterwards in the expo and said, can I get more information? And then the third win, it was a win for the association because they had happy members and happy corporate partners.
Well, thanks for all the advice, Bruce. Hey, by the way, if some of our guests would like to find out how to reach you, what's the best way for them to make contact with you?
Only two ways, either on LinkedIn or my website is brucerosenthal.associates.
Well, I hope that some of them will get in touch with you, and I know that you provide excellent service to them all. And to all of you out there, my friends, remember Associations Future's mission is to help associations navigate the ever-evolving landscape by anticipating trends, avoiding short-sighted decisions, and ensuring long-term success. Tune in again in 2 weeks, and I hope you'll gain insights, foresight, and actionable strategies for your association's journey. Have a wonderful day.